Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Georgia Street Weeklies. I'm Polly Fang from WOW TV, and we have Charlie Smith, the editor-in-chief of Georgia Street Newspapers. Hi, Charlie. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well, Polly. It's great to be back on WOW TV.
Thank you for joining us today. And there is a big piece of news for the hockey fans this week. Gino Odjik, he is diagnosed with terminal disease. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a disease called AL amyloidosis, which is a heart condition, and it causes a hardening of his heart. And Gino Odjik was a fan favorite with the Vancouver Canucks in the 1990s. And one of the reasons is he would always stand up for his teammates. And his best friend at the time was Pavel Bure, who's the only Vancouver Canuck to make it to the Hall of Fame. And he was a superstar from Russia. And he came here, he didn't know anyone, he was a young guy, and he befriended Gino Odjik, who's actually a First Nations hockey player, which is unusual. And Gino is this big, tough guy, but he has a heart of gold. And he's done a lot for the First Nations youth in British Columbia and across Canada. And he's very sick, and his teammates and his fans, they're all quite saddened by this because he's only 43 years old. Oh, no. And so he's in hospital right now. So he wrote an open letter to let people know about this situation.
Thank you for updating us on this piece of information. And also there's another news regards to the First Nation as well happening locally. Can you also update us about that as well?
Yes, there was a huge court decision, Supreme Court of Canada, which is the highest court in the land, and it ruled unanimously in an 8-0 decision for the first time in history that a certain plot of land, 1,700 square kilometers in the Chilcotin area of BC, is actually Aboriginal title exists there, and it's a Chilcotin, and it's a landmark case. It's one of the major cases in Aboriginal law because it's been called a game changer by Grand Chief Stuart Phillip of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs because it changes the dynamics and the power relationship between First Nations and resource companies because you've got a lot of logging, you've got mining, you've got pipelines. They all involve land which has not been ceded. There's a lot of history here too that underscores this, but the court has come down with this decision and the First Nations are celebrating because they see it as giving them a lot more strength in dealing with issues of concern, particularly in the use of the land.
Yeah. And how will that influence the pipeline decision happening here in Vancouver?
Yeah, this is a good question. There's two pipelines. There's the Enbridge pipeline, which is going from the Alberta oil sands to Kitimat, and there's a proposed pipeline, Kinder Morgan, going from the same area down to Burnaby, and it'll cross a lot of native land. The issue historically is back in 1763, and I'm going way back, but 1763, the American revolutionaries were agitating for independence, and the king at the time, King George, was worried that the First Nations may support the revolutionaries. So he issued a royal proclamation, and this royal proclamation said, we will not take your land without negotiation. And so this was the law of the land. It was issued by the king. But then in 1871, when British Columbia joined Confederation, joined Canada, the terms of union were that, okay, the federal government, you're going to be responsible for the First Nations, but British Columbia controls the land and resources. So you had a contradiction. You had the First Nations saying, well, the king promised the land wouldn't be taken away. Yeah. And then you had Canada forming and Canada saying, no, the province has control. So this was a big debate over a long period of time. Yeah. The province would not recognize the existence of Aboriginal title, that they had any stake in the land. They said that was extinguished when British Columbia joined Canada. Well, in 1997, in a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, they said Aboriginal title exists after Confederation. So they have a right to the land. Yeah. It was defined collectively, but they didn't say anywhere in British Columbia where that right existed. They sent the case back to a new trial. So this decision is the first time where they've actually identified land where the First Nations have a legal interest, and it either requires two things for the government for project to go ahead, like a pipeline or a forest mill or any type of thing like that. One, it must either have the consent of the First Nation, or two, the government must demonstrate that there's a compelling public interest and there have been adequate efforts to consult. So there is a chance that these pipeline projects could still go ahead if this is invoked, but I would anticipate that this will result in lengthy litigation and court action, and that could have an effect because there's basically 3 pipelines being proposed, 4 if you count one across Canada, but there's Enbridge, there's Kinder Morgan, and then the third one is the Keystone going down to the United States. The Keystone doesn't face nearly the same legal barriers as the ones going through British Columbia because they never negotiated treaties in British Columbia because of that arrangement. There were a few on Vancouver Island. They were called the Douglas Treaties. There was a Nisga'a Treaty signed more recently on the Tsawwassen. But by and large, most of British Columbia is considered unceded Aboriginal territory, and that has implications for investment.
Okay, thank you for letting us know about this. And maybe we need to keep our eyes on this case as well to know what will be happening to those important decisions coming up. And also there's another festival coming up in Vancouver. It's called the Indian Summer Festival. And I know you have some stories to tell us about that. Can you please let us know?
Yeah, I really enjoy the Indian Summer Festival. It's going this year from July 3rd to July 12th. And by Indian, it's actually referring to the country of India, not First Nations. And it's a very interesting event in terms of it combines literary, dance, there's sometimes some film components. And so this year, there's a real focus on writers. So one of the writers that's coming is a man from Delhi named Rana Dasgupta, and he's written a book about how capitalism is evolving in Delhi in the 21st century. And I interviewed him, and it offered lessons for what's happening in other countries too, in terms of these cities that are growing so rapidly and how people are coping with the pace of change.
So based on your interview with him, so what kind of parallels there are compared to some of the most famous fast-growing cities here in the world?
Yeah, like I think one of the fastest growing must be Shanghai, or Shenzhen is obviously another one that just exploded with growth. So in Delhi, what's happened is it's interesting there because it was a very protected economy, and they didn't have trade for many years after they became independent in 1947. Heavy state control over heavy industries and licensing systems, and they didn't have much economic growth by the time of the 1980s. Indira Gandhi was prime minister, and then her son Rajiv. Well, in 1991, the finance minister at the time, Manmohan Singh, he was an Cambridge-educated economist, and he'd long been arguing that India had to open up its borders. So you see the same thing happening with China and other countries, South Korea. So he did this, and since then there's been dramatic changes. There's been tremendous economic growth, but a lot of it has gone to the wealthier in India. And so Rana Dasgupta is actually from England, but he's half Indian, half British. But he moved to Delhi in 2000, so he's been watching this. He's a novelist, actually. But this was a big nonfiction book where he interviewed people in Delhi. And one of the things that's happened is he understands why there's such a rush to make money, because the cost of living has gone up. The land prices, the real estate prices, but even things like education, because in a lot of these countries, the education system is private. So people are having to come up with tuition for their children. Healthcare is expensive. You don't have a public healthcare system, unlike in other countries. You've got some, and so there's a rush to make money. But Delhi also has some differences from other places. One was there was a lot of violence when India became independent, partition between the Muslims and the Hindus and the Sikhs versus the Muslims, and so Rana Dasgupta makes the argument that still lingers, the effects of that over Delhi, and it's left people not really trusting their neighbors, and so it's quite a fascinating look. But he's not the only writer. There's another famous writer, Riza Aslam, is coming, and he's actually he's a Muslim, but he's written a biography of Jesus Christ, and this is quite controversial. And he's actually an Iranian American writer, And then Zarka Narwaz, she's of Indian descent, Muslim, who came up with the show Little Mosque on the Prairie, which was very popular on CBC for a few years. So there's going to be there's going to be a bunch of people. Another one, Anita Majumdar, who's a famous actress who was from Vancouver, but she's moved back east, so she's coming for the festival. And then there's lots of food. There's a bunch of restaurants, Vidges. There's there's going to be a banquet of food at the opening ceremony, and that's actually at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Garden in Chinatown on July 3rd. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so do we. We are looking forward to that too, to know more about these authors as well as amazing food. So please check back on Georgia Street Weeklies and check on the website to know more about this event. Thank you for joining us today, Charlies, and see you next week.